All right, hey everybody, Brad Cochran here, Patriot Gardens. We're going to go live here today. We're going to talk pretty quickly through what you can do with your small fruits here during the fall months. When we talk about small fruits, it can be hundreds of different things really, but predominantly what we do here in West Virginia with small fruits are, think brambles, strawberries, blueberries, fruit trees. Not as many people do grapes. A few people have a grapevine or two here and there, but not too many folks doing lots of grape production. But beyond that, small fruits kind of anything that's got a soft berry, pome fruit, stone fruits, so peaches, nectarines, apples, pears, the whole 9 yards. If it's got a small fruit on it, small soft fruit, we're going to kind of lump it in these categories. Both the good and the bad thing with them, if you have all of these things I just talked about, is pretty much everything needs slightly different care, not only during the fall, but during the spring and the summer and the winter. So today we're going to kind of talk through what we can do here during the fall months. So we're on October the 20th, what can we be doing here? While there's still a few leaves on before we really hit heavy frost, heavy winters, before everything's went dormant, what can we do to make sure our plants thrive through the winter and they're ready to really pick up here in the spring? If you've got questions, feel free to comment here, send us an email after, and we will get you that information just as quick as we can to help answer those questions. So I'm going to start with bramble fruits. If you don't have cultivated brambles, I can promise you've probably been out and you've picked the wild ones. So here we're talking blackberries, raspberries, wineberries, anything that kind of grows on a long cane and takes over the world in the wild. We've got a lot of cultivated varieties out there now, between summer-bearing fruits, thornless blackberries, even now raspberries and some blackberries even produce in the fall months, which is really, really nice. Kind of gives you production that off season. So that's nice to have. We've kind of bred in, like I said, that thornless capacity, so you no longer get chewed up by briars every time you try and go pick berries. With the cultivated plants, we get bigger berries, so now blackberries as big as your thumb really isn't out of the question. Always in a wild scenario, we think, well, there's no way, or that's the biggest berry I've ever seen because it's as big as your thumbnail. We get sweeter berries, we get some disease resistance, which is a lot better in comparison to those wild berries. As we look at the fall months, though, our management practices really vary between the type of plant we're growing, the varieties that we're growing, because if we're growing traditional summer berries or flora cane berries, it's a lot more hands-on management during the fall and into the winter. If we're doing our primocane production or that fall bearing production like I talked about, still some things happening in the fall, but the management's a lot easier as far as the hands-on, the physical labor. The biggest difference is going to be what we do for pruning. For flora canes, those summer-bearing varieties, we're actually going to completely prune out all the way to the ground those canes to produce this year. They're not going to produce any more. They're going to kind of look dead anyway. So we're going to go in and we're going to go with our set of loppers, our pruners, hand pruners, to the bottom, to the ground level, and we're going to take those older looking canes out, the ones that had fruit on them this year. We're going to leave the new canes, the young canes. You can really tell them apart. Really easy to tell which ones are which. Those primocanes, those new ones, we're going to leave them, let them grow for that following year. There are some pruning things you can do with those primocanes. We can actually cut those back to maybe chest high, head high. That's a pruning method called the hill method that we can use. You don't have to. You can if you want to. It just kind of helps keep things a little bit more manicured, a little bit under control. You can also do that pruning as we get closer to next spring. You can go back and kind of trim those up, give them a little bit of a haircut. If we're going to do those fall-bearing varieties, those primocane varieties, particularly raspberries, there are a few blackberry varieties now that do that. This is easy pruning. We're going to take a lawnmower, we're going to take a brush hog, we're going to take a weed eater, we're going to, if we want to use it by hand and get nice clean cuts, we're just going to prune every cane right down to ground level. And then next spring, they're going to come back up, they're going to bear again next fall, then we're going to cut them back down and do the same thing over and over and over again. So you can kind of see the floricane varieties, we're going to have a lot more tedious hands-on. It's going to be a bit slower process, whereas the primocanes, we're just going to wipe them all out, and then they're going to come right back the following year. The other thing we want to look at with brambles, in addition to pruning, is making sure our soils are in good shape. So this is where, if you haven't done a soil test for a couple of years, and you've heard us preach this pretty much every time we ever talk, you don't get a soil test, and this is no exception. Doesn't really matter when you do your soil test, as long as you take those results and implement the recommendations. So if you didn't do one in the spring, do one in the fall. It's a great time to do it. A little bit slower at the soil lab in Morgantown, so you can get your results back in a timely fashion. And then we've still got here another month or so that we can actually do some amending, get some lime down. We're not going to do as much in the fertilization side. We'll save that till spring. But especially with lime, if our pH is way out of balance, now we can actually get an application in. We can get ourselves moving in that right direction with our pH. So what we're looking at here in the fall, if you've got your soil test results in front of you, look at that liming recommendation, look at your pH. With brambles, we want to be somewhere in that 5.6, 5.8 area up to about 6.5. That's going to give you kind of a wide range there on that pH scale. So if your pH is below that, if your pH is, say, 5.0, or even, heaven forbid, like 4.5, some of our soils that haven't had much done to them over the years, it's not out of the question to have 4.5 pHs in West Virginia. So if we're down in that area, if you look at your soil test results, it's going to give you a liming recommendation. It may be 1,000 pounds per acre or 2,000 pounds per acre, or if you're very, very low, maybe 3,000 pounds per acre. What I usually recommend, if you've got those kind of levels, 2,000, 3,000 pounds to the acre, kind of break that down into maybe 2 or 3 different applications. So maybe do one here in the fall, do another one next spring, and then maybe another one the following fall. Reason being, 3,000 pounds of lime to the acre, depending on how big of a site you're doing, can get expensive. So if you're cutting that down into thirds and 1,000 pounds, you're saving yourself several dollars there. It's also easier, and then you know how farmers left here, sometimes you put 3,000 pounds of lime down to the acre, and tomorrow we get a golly washer rainstorm and it all ends up in the creek. If you put 1,000 pounds down and it all washes to the creek, we're limiting that nutrient loading, that calcium loading of our creeks, kind of messed up that microclimate, but also you're only out the expense of 1,000 pounds to the acre. So kind of gives yourself a little bit of leeway there. It also can slowly penetrate into that soil as well. So lots of reasons there why we kind of break that down into 2 or 3 different applications, both from a financial perspective and also just to make sure that that penetrates the soil, and we've got a little bit of leeway there to get that pH back up a little bit. I normally don't recommend fertilization in the fall, and there's a couple of reasons for that. Unless your nutrients are just way out of whack and you literally have more or less barren earth, I'm going to tell you to hold off until the spring for fertilization. And that pretty much goes for brambles all the way through blueberries, strawberries, and fruit trees for that matter. We want our brambles to use that fertilizer as opposed to grass, weeds, or just generally kind of washing out while those plants are dormant. So we want to wait till the spring, put that fertilizer application down, utilize those soil test recommendations to put that fertilizer down in the spring when those plants are active and ready to take it up and utilize it. Otherwise, you put it down in the fall. Say if we put it down in October, we're not going to break dormancy till March, April, depending on what the weather looks like. So basically that fertilizer sat there, it's kind of washed out into the soil, maybe washed through the soil depending on what our snow loads are, and that expense that you went through, that time that you went through has kind of been for naught. So that's why I usually don't recommend a fall fertilization unless you're just way out of whack. And even then I probably wouldn't do the full recommendation in the fall. The last thing we want to look at for our brambles, mulch. You really, for bramble fruits and small fruits in general, there is no such thing as too much mulch. What it does, it kind of does two different things. It protects our roots from freezing weather, freezing temperatures, freezing soil during the winter months. So it gives that nice 2, 3, 4 inch thick layer of protection for those roots. So we're not going to have any kind of damage as we fire back up in the spring. But also over time, that mulch will break down into a nice layer of compost that will add those nutrients back into the soil. So it's kind of that great big circle of life. So we get the benefit for the winter months, but then a year or two down the road, as that breaks down, we get the benefit of those added nutrients. If you don't have access to hardwood mulch or you've just got a compost pile that you want to utilize and kind of a small berry patch, you can certainly use a good thick layer of compost as a mulch layer. Generally anything, we can call anything mulch as long as we're adding a good enough layer to provide that wintertime protection for those roots. So if you've got compost that's ready to go, you can put that down. If you've got access to hardwood mulch, or that's something you want to use, make sure it's been aged, which most bag mulches have been aged, most bulk mulches have been aged at least 6 months or so to kind of let that breakdown process start. The other thing you can use, and again, this is where making sure you're familiar with where you're getting it from, making sure it's aged, are wood chips. Wood chips make for a great mulch. The thing is, we want to make sure they're not fresh and they've been aged for at least 6 months, if not 9 or 12 months. A full year on wood chips is great if we can get there. But at least 6 months is what we want to have in that aging process. It lets a good bit of that nitrogen kind of leach out. It starts to break down that compost process. So when we put it down on our ground, we're not going to suck up all the nutrients. We're actually going to start to be adding nutrients back into the soil. So that's what we're looking at for brambles, like I said, from kind of the mulching process and so on. So now we'll move ahead to talk about blueberries. Blueberries, especially as we get up into maturity, and high bush blueberries in particular, these are big plants. They really are. So they need a good bit of care. Now, what you'll hear as I talk through blueberries and fruit trees, you're going to hear me preach a lot of the same stuff that I just talked about on brambles. So soil tests, don't guess soil tests. This is a great time to be doing your liming program. It's a great time to kind of get ahead of the game for spring. Even if you don't want to add lime, but you want to go ahead and do your soil test, that way you're ready to rock and roll when March, April hits. You certainly go for it. But with blueberries, I'm going to wait until later on in the winter to prune. Reason being, we want to make sure that plant focuses more on packing in those nutrients and getting ready for the dormant season to make it through the winter, storing those energies up. So rather than pruning while that plant is still kind of active and hasn't went completely into dormancy, because what that does is it kind of changes its mind rather than focusing for winter to, oh man, now I got to close up all these wounds. Now I've got to do all these things because he's trying to kill me. What I would rather do is wait until winter when we're in that dormancy. We don't have many diseases, if any, floating around, very few insects to speak of that can cause other damage. So the plant can then just kind of focus all of its efforts on getting ready for winter as opposed to anything else that it kind of needs to be aware of. So during the fall months, again, heavy mulching, except the difference with our blueberries is we want that pH almost as low as we can get it. I mean, we almost want that pH to be like heavy acid will start to burn your skin a little bit. So, we're trying to get that pH down to even 4.5 if we can. So our mulching, we want to use pine bark mulch, pine straw. You can use compost. Again, it's not really going to help drive or keep your pH down, but it makes for a good mulch layer. You can use hardwood mulch. It's going to be acidic, but not nearly as acidic as that pine bark or that pine straw. Aged wood chips, again, we want to focus more on that pine. If you can get wood chips that are pine, or there's a sawmill that's been cutting some pine, sawdust works great. Again, we want to age that just a little bit. But what we're really focusing on with blueberries is the roots on blueberries are only about 2 or 3 inches deep underground. So we get a good hard week of 0-degree weather, and those roots are not going to be real happy if we don't have a good layer of protection there. So we want to really make sure that we're at least 4 inches of mulch through those winter months. If we get into the spring and the summer and we want to rake a little bit of that mulch off, you can. You don't have to. I normally just leave it there and a lot of times add more. But really, definitely through the winter months, we want to have about 4 inches of mulch on top. Again, based upon our soil test, we're going to do any soil amending. I can just about assure you we're not going to add lime to a blueberry patch because we really want that pH to be really as low as we can get it. In fact, depending on what we get back as a soil sample, we may be adding sulfur to actually drop that pH as opposed to lime to get it back up. So that's kind of what we're looking at there with blueberries. Now, as we move into the winter months, after we get to dormancy, this is where experience helps on the pruning side. Blueberry pruning can get a little bit confusing, especially if you've not done it before, if you're kind of a first timer in a blueberry production system. With our brambles, we're really only going to have canes that are 2 years old. And that's going to be the oldest cane we have in a bramble patch unless we just miss one during that pruning practice. With our blueberries, we're going to have 1-year-old canes, 2-year-old canes, 3-year-old canes, 4-year-old canes, and 5-year-old canes, all growing out of that same plant. So we're going to have a big range of plant ages there. So it gets a little bit easier the more you've pruned. Once you've done it for a couple of years, you can kind of start to, okay, yeah, that's a brand new cane there. That one's probably 5 years old. That one's, there's a 3-year-old. So you start to just visually kind of know, what ages we're looking at. As you get started, what I usually recommend is get you some different colored flagging, get you some different colored paint, use something so you can actually kind of go in and really age those canes yourself. So look at this one, put a pink flag on a 1-year-old cane, put a yellow flag on a 2-year-old cane, put a red flag on a 3-year-old cane, and so on, until you can really start to familiarize yourself with about what ages we're looking at, because we do want to have that range. Because our 1-year-old canes, we're not going to have fruit on. Our 2-year-old canes, we're going to get some fruit, but not mature. It's not going to be a mature cane with full production. Our 3-year-old canes, we're going to start to get to that peak production. 4-year-old, same. 5-year-old is going to start to peter off a little bit. So that's kind of why we want to have that variety of age ranges there. So we're always in good production, and it allows for consistent, sustainable production over the years. Because really and truly, like I said, we're not going to get to that full production until about 3 years with that cane. In order to promote good root growth, to get that blueberry established, say you just planted our blueberries this past spring, or maybe you want to try to get your hands on some fall blueberries to plant right now. The first couple of years, we want to take off fruiting buds, just so we can focus on what's happening underground, because again, those roots are are shallow, not necessarily small. It's an expansive root system, but they're only 2 or 3 inches under the ground. So we want to get that plant as strong as possible, have a good root system before we kind of force it to get into that fruiting stage. So we're really not going to get production until those plants are about 3 years old or so. As we look at pruning on our blueberries, know that the fruit's produced on the previous season's growth. So you're not going to get anything in what grew this year. It's actually going to come on next year on that. So as we're pruning, that's something we want to keep in mind. We want to have good strong lateral branches that come out, because that's where all of our buds are going to pop out next spring. So anything you see that's kind of stunted, a little bit weak, go ahead and remove that during the pruning practice. We want to leave those good strong lateral branches. Once our canes start to kind of look a little weak, petered out, once we get up into that 5-year-old age range, we're just going to take that whole cane all the way out of the ground and kind of restart that whole circle of life again. Again, we want to try to have equal numbers of canes best we can. So you may have 6 or 8 canes that are in production. You may have a couple of 1-year-olds, a couple of 2-year-olds, and then 3, 4s, and 5s. Will be kind of how that works out. Anything that's kind of weak, sprawling, ugly, disease, get rid of it. We want to try to keep that canopy as open as we can. Keep in mind these are bushes, so it's going to be hard to keep that canopy really, really open. But as much light and as much air as we can get pushed through there, the better off. Not going to talk a lot about grapes, but I do want to mention grapes, just for the folks that do have those in production. Again, mulching, mulch. Hardwood mulch works well here. Compost works even better, but it's going to take a lot of compost if you have a lot of grapes. So that's something to keep in mind. We want to avoid using pine bark, pine straw. Many of those pine mulches are going to push that pH down, and grapes are really finicky to pH ups and downs. So we really want to try to keep that pH between about 6 and 6.5. So lime's going to be your best friend here, along with a good soil test. So again, I know I've preached lime, I've preached soil testing. I'll keep preaching it, because if we don't have good soil, I can assure you we're not going to have good production. Again, like blueberries, we're going to kind of wait until the dead of winter for the full-scale pruning. But as we kind of look at those plants now, as we look at them, starting in about September, if we see things that are diseased and really just kind of gnarly looking, they've got insect problem, disease problems, go ahead and get rid of it and get those, any of that vine that you prune out that's diseased, burn it, throw it in a trash bag, put it in your garbage, get it off your site, because that's going to help to cut down on disease pressure starting off the very next year. Because a lot of those diseases will overwinter right there in your grapevines or in your vineyard. With strawberries, so the one thing to keep in mind with strawberries is they require a cold cycle before you'll get production into that following season. So they need to get cold. They like it when it's cold. But at the same time, they don't like to get overly cold, or they don't like to sit in a bunch of snow. They don't like to certainly be frozen. So that's why we want to cover with a really thick, at least 4-inch layer of straw, hence the name strawberries. So that gives good protection from freezing and from snow. It's going to keep all that ice, going to keep all that snow off the berries themselves or off the plants. It's also going to provide a good layer of insulation on those roots. The good thing about straw is it's really easy to take a rake through your strawberry patch. Just pull that straw off to the side. Then you can reuse the straw somewhere else. You can put it in a compost pile, let it compost down. For that matter, you can even leave it kind of in between your plants, just to kind of give an area as those strawberries grow. It's going to lay on that clean mulch. You're not going to have a lot of dirty, soil-covered strawberries that are laying right on the ground. It's a lot easier than hardwood mulch to get off. You can use hardwood mulch in a strawberry patch, but you're going to kind of be in there on your hands and knees, really pulling all that heavy hardwood mulch off. You're not ever going to really get it off. Whereas with straw, it's all kind of stuck together, it's wet, you can just kind of pull that off with your hand really easy. Soil adjustments, soil amendments, lime. Again, with strawberries, we're looking somewhere in those same pH ranges where we got brambles, so somewhere in that 5.8 to 6.5 ballpark is what I'm going to look at there for strawberries. The reason we want to use straw rather than hay, hay in West Virginia is going to be full of seeds of some sort, whether that's weeds, whether that's going to be your orchard grasses or your fescue or whatever's in your hay mix. Because when we make that hay, we're going to have seed heads on it. It may be clover, it may be again any of those other orchard grasses, things like that. I can assure you, you're going to have seeds into your strawberry patch, into your bed. What happens when we get competitive seeds? We're going to get grass, we're going to get weeds, we're going to get all this other competition to our strawberries. Whereas with straw, most times, I would say 90% of the time, a bale of straw is going to be clean of pretty much all seed heads. If it's not, it's going to mostly be wheat seed, and that's not going to be such a terrible thing. It will compete, but it's also easy to kind of till back in as well. So you're going to have less seeds, so anything you do have that comes up, it's going to be easy to take out of that bed. The other thing you can kind of do right now is if you've had runners, so say you've got a raised bed or just a strawberry patch that you've just kind of let go, you let your runners go, and it's turned into this matted, crazy mess where you can't even really see the ground. Now's a good time to thin those out and even transplant those runners that have rooted. You can just literally cut them off the mother plant, dig them out, and take and plant those elsewhere. So you can double, triple the size of your strawberry patch just by moving those runners, catching those and getting them replanted. What that does is next spring, when everything kind of fires back up again, we pull that straw off, and we're going to have really good airflow. It's going to cut down on our fungal problems, and also going to cut down on those rotting strawberries. So the more moisture that's there when the strawberries are on, the better chance we've got of those strawberries kind of rotting out. All right, and the last thing I'm going to talk about are fruit trees. Again, soil amendments, particularly lime, if we need to get that pH up. Most of our fruit trees, again, 5.5, 6.5 in the pH range. Usually somewhere 5.5 to 6 is where they're happier, but they'll be okay up to about 6.5 as well. What I would recommend, especially if your trees look less than stellar through the growing season, or especially if you've had a bumper crop this year, in September, so even if you've got apples hanging, that's okay. September, start to think about maybe a small fertilizer application. So again, it's going to be, if you're loaded with a bumper crop, that's going to be a time to think about. On the flip side, if your tree wasn't real happy this year, looked kind of gnarly, slow growing, not a lot of new growth on a younger tree, think about doing a fertilizer application then. So September, mid-September, 1st of October, you can do that. And so what that does is that makes sure that as that tree is starting to prepare for dormancy, it can suck up as many nutrients as possible and store those away for wintertime use, and also to help break bud during those spring months. What I usually recommend for fertilizer is just whatever you can get your hands on. You can usually go to Lowe's, Home Depot, your local feed store, anywhere, and get your hands on 10-10-10. Is it the best? Probably not. Is it exactly what your tree needs? Probably not. But it's something, and it's easy to get your hands on. You're not out there trying to search for 10-20-20 or any other fertilizer combinations. You can usually get your hands on a 50-pound bag of 10-10-10, and that's going to be about the cheapest option you've got. What we're literally trying to do with the fall fertilizer application is just get that tree into dormancy with plenty of nutrients stored, so that once we get those right temperatures and everything starts to break down next spring, it's already got a good store of energy ready to go. while we don't want to prune yet on our fruit trees, because really here, as we sit on October the 20th, there are some fruit trees that still have apples hanging. We've got a late season apple. So what we want to do is, even if all of your apples have been harvested and that tree looks like it's kind of went dormant, let's just wait on our pruning. But what we can do while the weather's good, while we've still got leaves on the tree, we can really start to make a pruning plan. So you can see which limbs are a little bit diseased. Maybe they've got some fire blight from this past season on it. You mark that tree somehow, whether it's pull your phone out, take a picture, and then go into edit and you draw a red line on that limb. Okay, I know I want to take that one out. Or if it's something you can reach from the ground, hang a flag on it, put a little bit of paint on it. And that just tells you, hey, when I come back in this winter to prune, that one's gone. It's going all the way back to the main trunk, or I want to prune it back this far. You make those plans now. That way you're not out there in the wintertime when everything looks dead, trying to make your best guesses on, okay, well I think this is how I probably ought to prune it. If you've got the ability, you've got the time to get out there and plan ahead a little bit, I can assure you you'll be in a much better situation next spring when everything leaves back out. If we've got limbs that are broken, obviously you can kind of see that, but again, go ahead and mark that. If you've got things that are diseased, go ahead and mark it. If you've got ones that have had so much fruit on them that it's hanging down and you run your head into it every time you walk near the tree, prune it. If you're Chris Postaway, you're 6'10", and you're going to have a really tall tree. If you're me and you're 6 feet, you can have a little bit lower limbs. If you're 5 feet tall, you can have some lower limbs. So now's a good time to make those calls now while you can really see what's going on, because you're going to be so much further ahead. Then, again, I've preached this, but I'll preach it again, add mulch. If you don't have a good mulch layer, one of those trees now, definitely consider, especially those younger trees. Mulch on younger trees is really important. Older trees, they're established. If we get some cold spells, we're probably going to be okay on a tree that's 10 or 15 years old, because the bulk of those feeder roots are going to be lower down in the soil. They've got a good root system. Those younger trees, those trees that we just planted here in the spring, or even plant here in the fall, or maybe up to about 5 years old, even 10 years old, depending on how things are growing. We want to make sure that we put a good mulch layer down. Hardwood mulch works great, but what I will caution you is not to volcano mulch. And so what I'm talking on volcano mulching is when you come up on the trunk of the tree and you literally have a pile of mulch that's 6, 8, 10 inches deep up onto the trunk of that tree. That's going to cause you a lot of problems down the road. If you do it for a week and then you realize the error of your ways and you fix it, that's okay. But it's when you have mulch like that for years upon years upon years, you're going to rot out the bottom of that tree. You're going to attract every insect in the world to start chewing on the bottom of that tree. It's going to hold a lot of moisture there, so that's going to speed up that decomposition process. Also, mulch is decomposing, so it's going to attract those earthworms. It's going to attract all those beneficial insects to help break that down. They don't really know the difference in there between the bark of your tree and the hardwood mulch that's the bark off another tree. So they're going to eat it all. So what we want to do as we mulch on a tree is we want a really thin layer, like ½ inch, like barely just covering the soil right up against the trunk of that tree. And then we actually want to kind of build that and thicken that layer of mulch out further away from the trunk we get. So on a young tree, we want to go all the way out on the drip line. So we may have a 24 to 36 inch wide mulch ring on a younger tree. Now as those trees spread out, they get 10, 15 feet wide, you don't need to put a 10 or 15 foot wide mulch ring. It'd be great if you could, but that's an awful lot of mulch. So we can stick to that 36 inch kind of ring of mulch there around the tree. Reason being, again, it's going to hold a little extra moisture there. It's going to protect those roots when they're young. So all the same benefits that we have otherwise. But with fruit trees, we can mulch poorly, and that's really going to be a detriment as we go down the road. So kind of to recap, some things to do here in the fall to get ready. Prepare for winter pruning. Again, make a pruning plan. That's something we can certainly do. But also get your tools out. Make sure your tools are in good shape. Make sure the blades are sharp. Make sure you put a little bit of oil on them. Make sure they're functioning properly. Any repairs that need made. You had them out in the summertime doing a little bit of trimming, and you noticed things were sticking a little bit, or you kind of made that note to yourself, hey, I need to order a replacement blade for my hand pruners. Well, then you forgot. Well, now is a great time to trigger your mind, get all your stuff out, look at it, clean it, make sure everything's in good shape. If you need to make some repairs, you need to order that blade, order it. If you realize something's in disrepair, we're in October, we're not going to prune until January, you've got 2 or 3 months here to get new equipment. Put it on your Christmas list. So that's always something to keep in mind. Make sure your ladders are functioning. Last thing you want to do is get halfway up a fruit tree that's 15 feet tall and your ladder breaks on you. Well, you're stuck. Make sure everything's working good from the start. If you haven't done a soil sample, do it. If you need information on where to go for soil sampling, send us an email, message us here on Facebook. We can point you in the right direction to WVU Soil Lab. It's free. Definitely a service to take advantage of. If you've got your samples back already, start implementing a little bit. Just make a plan to implement next spring. Go ahead and start getting some quotes on your fertilizer, on your lime, those types of things. If you need a good chunk of lime, you're doing a good patch, you can contact your conservation district. About all of them have a liming program where it's cost share. Really makes your lime inexpensive, so it's a program to take advantage of if you have the opportunity and the need. And remember, you're not doing everything in the fall. You're not doing all of your off-season work in the fall. You're, by and large, you're making a plan. You're doing some kind of work in advance. So when spring rolls around, wintertime pruning rolls around, you're ready to go. You're not out there losing an hour trying to decide what limbs to prune. Whenever we have made that pruning plan, we just go out with loppers and just start going. So it really speeds the process up in the winter when you're out there on a sunny 25-degree day. You're not going to be out there quite as long. And then once spring rolls around and the weather breaks, we're ready to hit the ground running with our production. So, Chris, do we have any questions?
No.
All right. Well, thank you guys for watching. And if you guys want a copy of the slides that I kind of spoke off of, or need any other information, send us a message here, Patriot Gardens Facebook page. You can also send us an email, patriotgardens at gmail.com. We can get you that information sent out. So have a great day, and we will hopefully see you on Friday for our hands-on sausage making workshop. So we'll hopefully see you then. Thanks.